A woman 2 towns over called me last spring, completely puzzled. 3 of her best layers had gone from a strong, steady laydown to almost nothing over about 6 weeks. Every single one of those birds still looked fine standing in the run. No limping, no obvious illness, nothing a person glancing over the fence would ever catch. She had already ruled out the usual seasonal slowdown. She had already ruled out a predator scare too. She was starting to wonder if something was simply wrong with her whole setup, maybe the feed, maybe the water, maybe her own management. It turned out to be worms, and it is one of the most common calls I get every single spring. Internal parasites are genuinely one of the quietest problems a flock can carry. A chicken can be losing real ground to worms for weeks before a keeper sees a single outward sign. By the time something is obvious enough to notice from across the run, the birds have often already been carrying a heavy burden for a good while. That gap between the real problem starting and a keeper actually noticing it is exactly what makes this one worth understanding properly. I have kept birds my whole life, and worms are one of those things every single keeper deals with eventually, whether they realise it at the time or not. This is not about fear, and it's not about reaching for a wormer every few weeks purely out of habit. It's about knowing what to actually watch for, so a light problem gets caught and handled while it is still light. Catch it early and it costs almost nothing. Miss it for a season and it costs you real production and real money. Here is the mechanism worth understanding before the list itself even begins. Worm eggs pass out in a chicken's droppings and sit on the ground, in the litter, wherever birds spend most of their time. A bird picks those eggs back up simply by pecking around that same ground day after day. Some worms take a shortcut through what is called an intermediate host. A bird eats an earthworm, a slug or a beetle that has itself already picked up the eggs, and the parasite rides straight in through that meal instead. Once inside a new bird, the eggs hatch, mature in the gut over a few weeks, and start the whole cycle over again by laying their own eggs. A stationary run that never gets a rest makes this cycle worse every single season. The ground itself becomes more heavily loaded the longer the same birds walk the same patch without any break at all. Free ranging spreads a flock out over more ground, which genuinely helps with that specific problem. Free ranging also brings birds into contact with more of the slugs, beetles and earthworms that carry the eggs along in the first place. It's a genuine trade-off rather than a simple fix on its own, and both styles of keeping need their own version of the routine covered later in this video. A light worm burden causes almost no visible signs for a good while. A chicken is built to keep functioning normally even while some of its intake is quietly being diverted away from growth, feathering and egg production. That is exactly what makes this such a quiet problem to catch early. The signs only become obvious once the burden has grown heavy enough that the bird genuinely cannot compensate for it any longer. By that point, real ground has already been lost in condition in production, and sometimes in the bird itself. The 9 signs below are worth watching for well before things ever reach that heavier stage. Number 1, weight loss with a normal or even increased appetite. A bird carrying worms is often eating just as much as it always has, sometimes more. Its body is trying to compensate for nutrients being diverted away by the parasites living inside it. So appetite alone tells you almost nothing useful on its own. Pick birds up regularly and feel along the breastbone rather than judging condition by eye through all that feathering. A bird can look completely normal from a distance while genuinely losing condition underneath a full coat of feathers. This costs nothing beyond a few minutes of handling each bird. It's often the very first sign available well before anything shows up in the droppings or in laying rate itself. Number 2, a comb and wattles turning noticeably pale. Some of the more common internal parasites feed directly on blood inside the gut wall. A heavy enough burden causes a genuine mild anemia that shows up first as pale colouring in the comb and wattles, rather than the normal deep red you expect from a healthy bird. This is a slower change than an injury, building gradually over days rather than appearing overnight. It is easy to miss unless you are actually comparing a bird to how it looked a couple of weeks earlier rather than only how it looks today. Take a photo of each bird's comb every month or so during a routine check. Comparing photos side by side catches a gradual colour change that the eye alone tends to miss when you see the exact same bird every single day. Number 3, a laying rate that quietly drops and never really recovers. Every flock slows down somewhat with the seasons, and that normal pattern is exactly what makes a worm-related drop so easy to write off as nothing unusual at all. The genuine difference is timing and recovery, not the drop itself. A seasonal slowdown tracks with daylight and eventually turns back around on its own once the days lengthen again. A worm-related drop can start at any point in the year and simply continues without recovering even once daylight and weather improve. Keep a simple written note of roughly how many eggs come out of the coop each week, a pattern that will not turn back around after a few weeks, regardless of season, is genuinely worth investigating rather than waiting out. Number 4, droppings that turn watery or foamy without any change in feed. Normal chicken droppings vary quite a bit through the day, so this is about a genuine consistent shift rather than one odd dropping on one particular morning. A single strange dropping means very little on its own. A gut working around a real parasite burden often produces droppings that are noticeably more watery or foamy than usual. That change tends to hold for several days running rather than clearing up on its own within a day or two. Look at the droppings board first thing each morning as part of your normal routine. Do it before birds have walked through it and before it has had all day to dry out and change appearance in the sun. Number 5, actual worm segments or whole worms visible in droppings or around the vent. Tapeworm segments look like small flat grains of rice, sometimes still moving slightly when very fresh. Roundworms look like thin pale strands closer to a piece of cooked spaghetti than anything else you would normally see in a coop. Either one showing up is the clearest possible sign available. At that point, there is no longer any real question about whether a worm burden exists in that bird, only how heavy it has become. This is also the single most reliable moment to collect a genuine sample for a proper fecal test. You already have direct visual proof in hand rather than needing to guess from indirect signs alone. Number 6, a fluffed up, hunched posture, even in genuinely mild weather. A bird fighting off a parasite burden often holds itself the same way a bird fights off any illness. Tucked in, feathers puffed for warmth it does not actually need, and generally less active than the rest of the flock moving around it. On its own, this sign covers a long list of possible causes and means very little by itself. Paired with any other item on this list, it becomes a much stronger signal, specifically pointing toward worms rather than something else entirely. Watch how a bird holds itself first thing in the morning, before the whole flock is up and moving around normally. This particular sign is easiest to catch during that quieter early stretch of the day. Number 7, slower growth and delayed feathering in young birds. Growing pullets have genuinely higher nutritional needs than adult hens, which makes them more vulnerable to any parasite burden, pulling resources away from that growth right when they need them most. A young bird visibly behind its hatchmates in size or feathering, with no other obvious explanation, is worth a closer look for worms before anything else gets blamed. Weigh young birds weekly if you can manage it. A genuine weight plateau shows up in the numbers well before it becomes obvious just from looking at a group of birds together in the brooder or the grow-out pen. Number 8, one particular bird that keeps catching every minor bug going around, a chicken carrying a real ongoing worm burden, has less of its own resources left over for fighting off anything else. That same bird tends to be the one that comes down with every small passing thing before the rest of the flock ever shows a sign of it. If one bird stands out as consistently the first or the worst affected over and over, it is worth asking specifically whether worms are the real underlying reason behind that pattern. Keep a simple flock health log rather than relying on memory alone. A pattern of the same bird struggling repeatedly is far easier to spot on paper than it ever is by trying to recall the last few months purely from memory. Number 9. A previously well-managed flock suddenly needing far more feed for the same egg output. Feed conversion is one of the clearest numbers a keeper can actually track over time. A heavy enough worm burden shows up directly as more feed going in for less coming back out in eggs, even when nothing else about the setup has changed at all. This is one of the more expensive hidden costs of an untreated burden. It quietly eats into the household budget long before anyone thinks to blame parasites specifically for the difference. Track roughly how much feed a flock goes through each week against roughly how many eggs come back in return. A shift in that ratio that cannot be explained by season, weather or age is a genuine reason to look closer. Here is a simple seasonal routine worth building around everything covered on this list, the same one I actually run on my own ground. Every single week handle a few birds directly and check the droppings board first thing in the morning before anything disturbs it. This is the habit that catches most of these 9 signs early before any of them turn into something bigger. Every single month, take that comb photo, weigh any young birds you have coming up, and add up roughly how much feed went in against roughly how many eggs came out. Small drifts show up in numbers long before they show up to the eye. Twice a year, once in spring and once in fall, run a proper fecal float test through a vet office or a local agricultural extension service. It typically costs somewhere around $15 to $25. It's the only way to actually confirm a worm burden with real certainty rather than guessing from signs alone. A simple notebook kept near the coop door works just as well as anything fancier for tracking all of this. A line or two after each weekly check, comb colour, feed used, eggs collected, takes under a minute and builds a genuinely useful record within a single season. Patterns that are invisible week to week become obvious once you can look back across a full spring or a full fall side by side. That comparison is where a slow drift actually gets caught long before it turns into an emergency call. Add an extra check anytime several of these 9 signs show up together in the same bird or across more than one bird at once. That clustering is a much stronger signal than any single sign appearing on its own in isolation. Rotating a run onto fresh ground whenever possible genuinely helps break the reinfection cycle described earlier. Even a simple back and forth between 2 fenced areas stops birds from constantly repicking eggs off the exact same patch of soil day after day. A deep litter system managed properly, does something similar inside a coop itself. The composting process going on underneath is genuinely hostile to a lot of parasite eggs sitting in that bedding, breaking down the cycle indoors as well as out. Diatomaceous earth gets mentioned constantly in this space, and it does have a real supportive role worked into bedding and dust baths as ongoing prevention. It is not, on its own, a reliable fix once a heavy burden is already confirmed and established in a flock. Garlic and apple cider vinegar in the water fall into roughly that same category. Both are genuinely fine as everyday supportive habits on their own. Neither one is a substitute for an actual fecal test, and where that test confirms a real problem, an appropriate wormer used correctly under proper guidance is what actually clears it. Quarantine any new bird for a couple of weeks before it joins the main flock, and run a fecal check during that same window if you can manage it. New birds are one of the single most common ways a worm problem gets introduced into an otherwise clean flock in the first place. I have put together a complete flock health guide covering a full seasonal fecal testing calendar, a proper droppings board routine, and a simple feed and egg record sheet. It is linked below if you want the fuller version of everything covered here today. None of this replaces an actual fecal test read by someone qualified to read one. Any bird showing several of these signs together deserves a closer look the same day rather than waiting on it. A bird looking genuinely unwell, not simply a little off, deserves a same-day call to a vet or your local extension office rather than a guess based on a video. What this list gives you is the early warning system, the 9 things worth actually watching for so a light problem gets caught while it is still light and easy to turn around. So tonight, do the one thing that actually starts catching this early, handle a few birds, and check that droppings board first thing tomorrow morning before anything else disturbs it. If 2 or more of these 9 signs are already present, collect a sample and get a proper fecal test booked this week. Do not wait to see if things simply sort themselves out on their own. That woman 2 towns over got her fecal test done within days of that call. It confirmed a genuine roundworm burden across most of her flock. She treated it properly under guidance and had her layers back to a normal steady rate within about a month. Nothing about her setup was wrong to begin with. She simply had not yet learned what to watch for, and once she did, the whole thing stopped being a mystery and became a routine seasonal check instead of a crisis. I have watched this exact pattern play out more springs than I can easily count now. The flocks that handle it best are never the ones that panic at the first odd dropping they happen to notice. They are the ones kept by someone who checks regularly, keeps a simple record, and treats a fecal test as an ordinary part of flock care. Worms have always been part of keeping birds on real ground, and they only ever become a genuine problem when nobody is watching closely enough to catch them early.